Great. Another day. This is a sunny day, and I'm really happy and thankful for someone comment today. I saw he commented that my idea is a good idea. I think he mentioned the method of recording things to learn or recording things to um, help us to insist on some idea of us, some then we can keep it on. Um, I'm really happy. Thank you so much. They really make my day. And we live in a society, and the people influence each other. We 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 can do things to others positively. Yeah, by a smell, by see something canned. Um, when I walked out on a street, there there is a house. Mm, they put a blackboard. They put a blackboard in their garden. Words um, on the board, and then they change the material maybe a few days. Then those words so beautiful, so kind. I can remember one. Whether you color the word with you color the word red or you write the word with blue, you make it different. So be you. It's so, and last time I passed away this house with my two golden retrievers. It praise springtime because now it's spring in Melbourne, so uh, they praise springtime, and I think another day they say, mm, oh, uh, every day or whenever I s- uh, every day I spend with you. Every day spent with you is my favorite day. So today is my favorite day. It's from Winnie Pooh. So kind. When I passed away the house, I always stopped and look at their board and read. Sometimes you know the sentence I read a few times. Ah, so good, so kind. And another house is really impressed me. They write a lot of a lot of sentence in colorful in color paper, and they seize it into plastic, or I don't know how to say, seize it, and cut it into different shape, star or square, or triangle, all of shape, and they cut it, they hung it on the tree or hung it on the fence. So can, and some child, I think, they draw on the road, now on the road, path, on the path, their fence. They with colorful pen, they draw a, ring rainbow, or and write down some kind of sentence. That's so good, so nice. So we will learn. We will learn a lot from others. So we get a lot of positive information from others. We keep our heart open. We keep our we keep our heart open and we send others our positive things, our smile, our kind words. Yes, all those things. They so good. I feel so good. Yeah, let's begin. We can read almost 1 hour. But Philip could not live long in the rarefied air of the hilltops. What had happened to him when first he was seized by the religious emotion happened to him now. What had happened to him when first he was seized by the religious emotion happened to him now, because he felt so keenly the beauty of faith, because the desire of self-sacrifice burned in his heart with soul. His glance seemed inadequate to his ambition. He was tired out by the violence of his passion. His soul was filled on a sudden with a singular aridity, aridity. He began to forget the presence of God, which had seemed so surrounding, and his religion's exercise still very punctually performed, at merely formal. At first, he blamed himself for this falling away, and the fear of hellfire urged him to renewed vehemence. But the passion was dead, and gradually other interests distract his thoughts. Philip had a few friends. His habit of reading isolated him. It became such a need that after being in company for some time, he grew tired and restless. He was wine. He was wine of the wider knowledge he had uh, pursued, pursued so many books. His head was alert, and he had not the skill to hide his contempt for this companion's stupidity. They complained that he was concealed, and since he excelled only in matters which to them were unimportant, they asked satirically what he had to be conceited about. Let's let's see what this um per, how to read perusal perusal perusal. Hmm? No, perusal. No. Great. So let's get it off. Let's got it off. I don't want this highlight here. Perusal of so many books, 精读. Wow. Perusal of so many books. His mind was alert, and he had not the skill to hide his contempt for his company's and he had not the skill to hide his contempt for his companion's stupidity. You have to pretend. You have to hide. 轻蔑咯 contempt. Yes, contempt for his companion's stupidity. They complained that he was conceited, 自高自大的感觉 conceit 自负的 yes. They complained that he was conceited because he think others are stupid, so he was conceited. And since he excelled only in matters, No. Excel 只有这一块 Excel not no. I only want to highlight here. Excel. Since he excelled only in 擅长 擅长优于Since he excelled only in matters which to them were unimportant, they asked satirically what he had to be conceited about. Of course, satirically. Satirical.
Satirical.
Satirical. Satirical. 嘲讽 They asked satirically what he had to be conceited about. What he had to be conceited about. He was developing a sense of humor and found that he had a knack of seeing better things. He had a knack, I think, 忍不住的窍门技巧。Let's see how to read it, how to pronounce knack. It is knack. He had a knack, 技巧。He had a knack of seeing better things, which caught people on the raw. He said them because they amused him. He said them because they amused them, hardly realizing how much they hurt, and was much offended when he found that his victims regarded him with active dislike. The humiliation he suffered when first he went to school had caused in him a shrink from his fellow which he could never entirely overcome. Shy and silent, but though he did everything to alienate the sympathy of other boys, he longed with all his heart for the popularity which to some was so. He remained shy and silent, but though he did everything to alienate the sympathy of other boys. 理解转移放弃
Alienate.
alienate alienate, alienate 离间转移，离间 to 离间 the sympathy of other boys. He longed with all his heart for the popularity which to someone who 离间使疏远，使疏远，疏远。alienate, alienate the sympathy of other boys. He longed with all his heart for the popularity which to some was so easily accorded. So easily accorded. So easily accorded. 给予
accorded,
一致复合 This from his distance. This from his distance he admired in this from his distance he admired extravagantly, and though he was inclined to be more sarcastic with them than with others, though he made little jokes at their expense, he would have given anything to change places with them. In the form distance, he admired 猛烈的 extravagantly 过度的 yes 狂热的 This from his distance, he admired extravagantly, inclined to be more sarcastic with them than with others, though he made little jokes at their expense, anything to change places with them. Indeed, he would gladly have changed places with the tallest boy in the school who was whole of limb. He took to a singular habit. He would imagine that he was some boy whom had a particular fancy for. He would throw his soul, as it were, the other did. It was so vivid that he seemed for a moment really to be no longer himself. In this way, he enjoyed many intervals of fantastic happiness. At the beginning of the Christmas term which followed on his confirmation, Philip found himself moved into another study. One of the boys who shared it was called Rose. He was in the same form as Philip, and Philip had always looked upon him with envious admiration. Let's check. Admiration. Is it admiration? Let's see. Admiration. Yes, admiration. 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 In envious. Let's see, is it envious or not? Envious. Envious. Yes, great. Envious admiration. He was not good looking, though his large hand and big bone suggest he would be a tall man. He was clumsily made. He was clumsily made, but his eyes were charming, and when he laughed, he was constantly laughing. His face wrinkled all round them in a jolly way. He was neither he was neither clever nor stupid, but good enough at his work and better at games. He was a favorite with he was a favorite with masters and boys, and he in his turn liked everyone. When Philip was put in the study, he could not help seeing that the others, who had been together for 3 terms, welcomed him coldly. It made him nervous to feel himself an intruder, but he had learned to hide his feelings, and they found him quiet and unobtrusive and unobtrusive. 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 Can you read for me? Unobtrusive. 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 With Rose because he was as little able as everyone else to resist his charm. With Rose because he was as little able as anyone else to resist his charm. Philip was even more than usually shy and abrupt, and whether on account of this, unconsciously bent upon exerting the fascination he knew without, or whether from sheer kindness of heart. It was Rose who first took Philip into the circle. One day, quite suddenly, he asked Philip if he would walk to the football field with him. With Rose, with Rose, because he was as little uh, able as anyone else to resist his charm. Philip was even more than usual shy and abrupt, and whether on account of this, unconsciously bent upon exerting the fascination.发挥
exerting,
exerting, exerting the fascination he knew was his only better result, or whether from sheer kindness of heart it was Rose who first took Philip into the circle. One day, quite suddenly, he asked Philip if he would walk to the football field with him. Philip flushed. I can't walk fast enough for you, he said. Rod, come on. And just before they were setting out, some boy put his head in the study door and asked Rose to go with him. I can't, he answered. I have already promised Carrie. And just before they were setting out, some boy put his head in the study door and asked Rose to go with him. I can't, he answered. I've already promised Carrie. Don't bother about me, said Philip quickly. I shan't mind. Rot, said Rose. He looked at Philip with those good-natured eyes of his and laughed. Philip felt a curious tremor in his heart. 颤抖。站立。Then another word, I think Philip wrote. I want to wrote 就是瞎说的意思，不朽的 wrote， 胡乱说，应该就是这个意思。wrote looked at Philip with those good-natured eyes of his and laughed. Philip felt a curious tremor in his heart. In a little while, their friendship grew with boyish rapidity. The pair were inseparable. Other fellows wondered at the sudden intimacy, and Rose was asked what she saw in Philip. A bad chap, really. Soon they grew accustomed to the two walking into temple arm in arm or stroll round the precinct in the conversation. Whether one was the other, whenever one was the other could be, whether one also, and as though acknowledging his proprietorship, boys who wanted Rose would leave a message with Carrie. As though his proprietorship. Proprietorship.
Proprietorship.
Proprietorship.
Proprietorship.
Proprietorship. Proprietorship. Proprietorship. Boys who wanted Rose would leave a message with Carrie. Philip at first was reserved. He would not let himself yield entirely to the proud joy that filled him. But presently his distrust of the fates gave way before a wild happiness. He thought Rose the most wonderful fellow he had ever seen. His books now were insignificant. He could not bother about them when there was something infinitely more important to occupy him. Rose's friends used to come in to tea in the study sometimes, or sit about when there was nothing better to do. Rose liked a crowd and the chance of a ride, and they found and Rose arranged by which train they should go back, so that they might meet at the station and have tea in the town before returning to home. Philip went home with a heavy heart. He thought of Rose. All through the holiday, and his fancy was active with the things they would do together next term. He was bored at the vicarage, and when on the last day his uncle put him the unusual question, put him the usual question in the usual facetious in the usual facetious tone. 看一下的 facetious tone. It means 滑稽的、好笑的。In the usual facetious tone. Well, are you glad to be going back to school? Philip answered joyfully. Rather, in order to be sure of meeting Rose at the station, he took an earlier train than he usually did, and he waited about the platform for an hour. When the train came in from Feversham, where he knew Rose had to change, he ran along it excitedly, but Rose was not there. He lost the person. Tell him what another train was due. He waited, but again he was disappointed, and he was cold and hungry, so he walked through side street and slum, by a short cut to the school. He found Rose in the study, with his feet on the chimney piece, talking 18 to a dozen with half a dozen boys, who were sitting on whatever there was to sit on. He took his hand with Philip enthusiastically. But Philip's face fell, for he realized that Rose had forgotten all about their appointment. I see. Why are you so late? Said Rose. I thought you would never come. You were at the station at half past 4, said another boy. I saw you when I came. Philip blushed a little. He didn't want Rose to know that he had been such a fool as to. I had to see about a friend of my people's, he invented rapidly. I was asked to see her off. But his disappointment made him a little sulky. He sat in silence, and when spoken to answered in monosyllables. He was to have it out with Rose when he was not alone. But when the other had gone, Rose at once came over and sat on the arm of their chair in which Philip was lounging. I say, I'm jolly glad we are in the same study this term, Ripping, isn't it? He seemed so genuinely pleased to see Philip that Philip's annoyance vanished. They began, as if they had not been separated for 5 minutes, to talk eagerly of the thousand things that interested them. At first, Philip had been too grateful for Rose's friendship to make any demand on him. He took things as they came and enjoyed life. But presently he began to resent Rose's university ambitious um, amiability. He wanted a more exclusive attachment, and he claimed as a right what before he had accepted as a favor. He watched jealous uh, He watched jealously Rose's companionship with others, and though he knew it was unreasonable, could not help things to him. If Rose spent an hour playing the fool in another study, Philip will receive him to his own to his own with a sullen frown. He would sulk for a day, and he suffered more because Rose either didn't notice his ill humor or deliberately ignored it. Not seldom, knowing but all the time, but stupid he was, would force would force a quarrel, and they would not speak to each other for a couple of days. But Philip could not bear to be angry with him long, and even when convenience that had convenience what convenienced that he was in the right, who would apologize humbly. Then for a week they would be as great friends as ever. But the best was over, and Philip could see that Rose often walked with him merely from old habit or from fear of his anger. They had not so much to say to one another as at first, and Rose was often bored. Philip felt that his lameness began to irritate him. Towards the end of the term, 2 or 3 boys caught scarlet fever, and there was much talk of sending them all home in order to escape an epidemic. But the sufferers were but the sufferer but the sufferers were isolated, and since no one were attacked, it was supposed that the outbreak was stopped. One of the stricken was Philip. He remained in hospital through the Easter holidays, and at the beginning of the summer to the vicarage to get a little fresh air. The vicar, notwithstanding medical assurance that the boy was no longer was infectious, infectious. Let's see, infectious, infectious. 我什么时候开始不会读这个词的了呢？Infectious was no longer infectious, received him
Infectious.
with suspicion. He thought it very inconsiderate of the doctor to suggest that his convalescence should be spent by the seaside. Convalescence. convalescence,
convalescence,
convalescence, 康复啊，convalescence 恢复，恢复。should be spent by the seaside and consented to have him in the house only because there was nowhere else he could go. Philip went back to school at half term. He had forgotten the quarrel he had had with Rose, but remembered he was his greatest friend. He knew that he had been silly. He made up his mind to be more reasonable. During his illness Rose had sent him a couple of little notes, and he had ended each with the words, "Hurry up and come back." Philip thought Rose must be looking forward as much to his return as he was himself to see Rose. He found that owing to the death from scarlet fever of one of the boys, he found the owing to the death from scarlet fever of one of the boys in the sixth there had been in the study, and Rose was no longer in his. Rose was no longer in his. It was bitter disappointment, but as soon as he arrived the burst into Rose's study. Rose was sitting at his desk, working with a boy called Hunter, and turned round crossly as Philip came in. "Who the devil that?" he cried, and then seeing Philip, "Oh, it's you!" Philip stopped in embarrassment. I thought I'd come in and see how you were." "We were just walking." Hunter broke into the conversation. "When did you get back?" "5 minutes ago." They sat and looked at him as though he was disturbing them. They evidently expected him to go quickly. Philip reddened. "I will be off. You might look in when you are done. When you're done. You might look in when you're done," he said to Rose. Philip closed the door behind him and limped back to his own study. He felt frightfully hurt. Rose, far from seeming glad to see him, had looked almost put off. They might never have been more than acquaintances, though he waited in his study, not leaving it for a moment in case just then Rose should come. His friendship never his friend never appeared, and the next morning when he went in and and the next morning when he went in to prayers, he saw Rose and Hunter singing along arm in arm. What he could not see for himself others told him. He had forgotten that 3 months is a long time in a schoolboy's life, and though he had passed them in the solitude Rose had lived in the world, and though he had passed them in solitude Rose had lived in the world. Hunter had stepped into the vacant place. Philip found that Rose was quite avoiding him, but he kept a situation without putting it into words. He waited till he was sure Rose was alone in his study and went in. "May I come in?" he asked. Rose looked at him with an embarrassment that made him angry with Philip. Yes, if you want to." "It's very kind of you," said Philip, sarcastically. "What do you want? I say, why have you been so rotten since I came back?" "Oh, don't be an ass," said Rose. "I don't know what you see in Hunter. That's my business." Philip looked down. He could not bring himself to see what was in his heart. He was afraid of humiliating himself up. "I've got to go to the gym," he sighed. When he was at the door, Philip forced himself to speak. "I say, Rose, don't be a perfect beast." "Oh, go to hell." Rose slammed the door behind him and left Philip alone. Philip shivered with rage. He went back to his study and turned the conversation over in his mind. He hated Rose now. He wanted to hurt him. He hated Rose now. He thought of biting things. He might have said the biting things he might have said to him. He brooded over the end of the relationship and fancied talking of it. In his sensitiveness, he saw smears and wondering in other fellows' manner when they were not bothering their head with him at all. He imagined to himself what they were saying. After all, it wasn't likely to last long. I wonder he ever struck Carrie at all later. To show his to show his indifference, he struck up a violent friendship with a boy called Sharp, who he hated and despised. He was a London boy with a loutish hair, a heavy fellow with the beginning of the moustache on his lip, and bushy eyebrows that joined one another across the bridge of his nose. He had a soft hand and manner to sew is this year. He had a soft hand and manner to sew to swallow. I already copied.
Suave.
To swallow 老于世故的，有礼貌的。老故，老于世故的。He had a soft hand and manner to swallow for his year. He spoke with the suspicion of a Cockney accent. He was one of those boys who are too slack to play games, and he exercised great ingenuity in making excuse to avoid such as were compla- com- compulsory 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 义务的必修的 such was compulsory
compulsory,
强迫的义务的He was regarded by boys and masters with a vigor dislike, and it was from arrogance that Philip now sought his society. Sharp in a couple of terms was going to Germany for a year. Sharp in a couple of terms was going to Germany for a year. He hated school, which he looked upon as an indignity to be endured till he was old enough to go out into the world. London was all he cared for, and he had many stories to tell of his doings there during the holidays. From his conversation, he spoke in a soft, deep-toned voice. There emerged the vague rumor of the London street at night. Philip listened to him at once, fascinated and rebelled. With his vivid fancy, he seemed to see the surging through. Go ahead. No, I'm not talking to you. With his vivid found the pit door of theatre and the glitter of cheap restaurant bars where men half drunk sat on high stools talking with barmaids. Street, and under the street lamps the mysterious passing of crowds band upon Sharp lent him cheap novel from Holloway, which Philip read in his cubicle with a sort of wonderful fear. Once Rose tried to effect a reconciliation. Reconciliation. He was a good-natured fellow who did not like having enemies. Try to effect a reconciliation. Okay, try to effect a reconciliation. To effect he was a good-natured fellow who did not like having enemies. I say, Carrie, why are you being such a silly ass? It doesn't do you any good cutting me and all that. I don't know what do you mean, answered Philip. Well, I don't see why you shouldn't talk. You bore me, said Philip. Please yourself. Rose shrugged his shoulder and left him. Philip was very white. as he always became when he was moved, and his heart beat violently. When Rose went away, he felt suddenly sick with misery. He didn't know why he had answered in that fashion. He would have given anything to be friends with Rose. He hated to have quarreled with him, and now that he saw he had given him pain, he was very sorry. But at the moment he had not been master of himself. It seemed like some devil had seized him, forcing him to say bitter things against his will. Even though at the time he wanted to shake hands with Rose and meet him more than halfway the desire to wound the desire to wound had been too strong for him. He had wanted to be revenged himself for revenge He had wanted to revenge himself for the pain and the humiliation he had endured. It was pride. It was folly too, for he knew that Rose would not care at all. Well, he would suffer bitterly. The thought came to him that he would go to Rose and say, I say, I'm sorry, I couldn't help it.